Okay, how's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, well, so in today's episode, I thought I'd try to briefly talk a bit about some of the differences between Eastern and Western philosophy. You know, Kipling once said that East is East and West is West, and the twain shall never meet. Now, I'm not sure what he meant there by this exactly, but I wonder if it's something that we can apply here to these two basic philosophical orientations. After all, they do seem quite different, at least in outline. Although, of course, it's important to say that there are always exceptions to the generalizations. And it is important to emphasize that these are just generalizations that I'm going to give. There's nothing nuanced here. Okay, so that said though, so what are some of the essential differences? Well, let's begin with the notion of self, or personal identity, because it seems to me that that's a really important one. Okay, so in the West, many philosophers have advanced conceptions of the self, like John Locke and Kant, for example, with, of course, David Hume being an important exception. But you might say that in a way that it all really begins with René Descartes. For Descartes, the self is something that's made very explicit and autonomous. And what the self is, Descartes argues, is an independent thinking thing or substance that's completely separate from the body. The point is that with him, the self is made totally distinct. It stands out. And in a way, it's pitted against the rest of the world, a world which is totally outside of it and completely different from it. Okay, but now let's go eastward. Let's go, for example, to Buddhism. So according to the Buddhist teaching, the self doesn't exist. No, the self is a complete illusion, one that's due to our total ignorance of the true nature of the world. The fact of the matter is that the true nature of the world for the Buddhists is that everything is constantly changing, which of course leaves little room for anything like an enduring self. And to come to recognize this illusion, that is the fundamental goal for the Buddhists. It's to achieve, no self, to move towards a kind of self-negation. To quote a commentator, the true sage has no name. Okay, but Buddhism's not the only Eastern view which has a different view of the self from the West. I mean, for example, let's take Confucianism. There, the self is understood, again, not as some completely independent or atomistic substance, but as more of a kind of relational self, one which is tied to and dependent on other people, one which is more obedient to the norms and the requirements of those members which make up society, one where the ideal or ultimate self is essentially something like the harmonization of oneself with others in society. So you might say then that there is on the whole in Eastern philosophy, especially compared to Western thought, a kind of subordination of the individual. So unlike in Descartes and the Western tradition that basically follows him, the self is not this totally unique, self-sufficient thing that exists entirely separately from all other individuals. Actually, it's interesting. One reason why it is the East tends to subordinate the individual or see the self as relational and the West holds the opposite view may in fact be due to, of all things, early geography. Now, I'm no expert here, but you see some studies have looked to the early geography of the East, especially or in particular China, and noticed that way back then, when people had to work in huge open fields, they needed cooperation from others, and so they had to work in groups. But in Greece, which of course provides the foundation of Western thought, the geography wasn't like this. No, there are smaller, tighter spaces there, like fishing areas, for example. So people could essentially work on their own. Little communal work was necessary. So, well, there you go then. Simple geography may be at least one important reason for why it is Easterners and Westerners have such different conceptions of the value of the individual. Okay, well, so what's another important difference between Eastern and Western philosophy? Well, so I would say that there's a bit more of a practical orientation to Eastern philosophy than there is in Western philosophy. In other words, Western philosophy seems to be more theoretical. It emphasizes, at least ultimately, more of the purely intellectual than it does the pragmatic. Now, what I mean mostly by this, when I say pragmatic, is that the primary goal of Eastern philosophy is the personal realization of the experience of a higher reality. So there's an important self-actualization or self-awakening component to it. In this sense, a lot of Eastern philosophy, you might say, reveals its affiliation with religion. That's to say, it's about personal experience, and it has a salvational aspect to it. And what's more, it says that ultimate reality at the end of the day is accessed mostly through intuition, and so not something that's completely subject to empirical and rational investigation. Well, Western philosophy is not like this. That's not its primary goal. No, what it seeks is something more along the lines of an accurate description of reality and theoretical truth. Maybe another way of saying all this is that while Western philosophy studies the world from a clear subject-object relation, as a scientist dispassionately studies a flower, Eastern philosophy seeks to transcend or overcome this dichotomy, this subject-object relationship. In other words, it seeks to merge or subordinate the individual into the larger oneness or larger self with a capital S. And I should mention one more thing, one more important difference, if it's not already obvious, and that is that the phenomenal order of ordinary experience is often regarded by Eastern thinking as, in one way or another, unreal. Or at least it's a level of reality that's often considered inferior in some way. It's not as deep or as true. Well, Western philosophy tends not to see things like that. No, it usually takes finite, everyday existence as it is, and it gives it, let's say, its own independent status. All this said, though, it needs to be said that Eastern and Western views do seem to have something pretty important in common. It's this. It's that they both, on the whole, emphasize the importance of love and respect. In particular, they both, in their own way, preach the centrality of compassion. I mean, whether it's Christianity's golden rule, or Kant's ethics of respect, or Buddhism's loving kindness, or the Jainists' doctrine of nonviolence, love in its various forms is paramount. And let's face it, if we're all going to agree on one universal ideal, that's not a bad one to get together on. Bye for now.